Welcome to the next lesson, which is project scope management. This is the second knowledge area that we are going to look at from a PMP perspective. So let's see what are the things we are going to look at. What is project scope management? Some of the key terms that are used in project scope management, and difference between project scope and product scope, and the project scope management processes. So we have 6 processes here. The first 4 process from plan scope management to create WBS is part of planning process group, and validate and control scope is part of your monitoring and controlling process group. So in 6th edition, there are a few things that are given with respect to Agile. Agile is a little bit being introduced here. So let's look at the 2 different types of how we approach the scope is all about. So one is predictive and adaptive, which is Agile based. So predictive is generally what we call the traditional or the waterfall, or it's completely plan driven. So project manager creates a plan end to end and then goes about executing the plan, and then finally the requirements of the scope is arrived, then it is developed, and then it is delivered to the customer. So in Agile, even if the scope is not complete, so probably we can still go ahead and do the project, because it's more adaptive, and then it's more, we call it as progressive elaboration. So we can elaborate the scope progressively. So predictive, knowledge and requirements management, which is done upfront, validation, control tools, everything is put in process and put in place. The development approach is clear, stability of requirements is clear, the governance, all these are clear in predictive, where it's completely plan driven. In adaptive, Agile, scope is not understood at the beginning. So the team spends less time to define and agree on scope at the beginning. They spend more time to establish the processes for ongoing discovery and refinement of scope. Agile methods build and review prototypes and release versions to refine the requirements. As a result, scope is defined and redefined throughout the project. So this is what we call it as progressive elaboration. Progressive elaboration. So in Agile, so we don't need to have the scope completely defined. So as and when we have more clarity in the scope, we can build that project, and then we can keep on elaborating the scope over a period of time. Rather than in predictive, we have to freeze the scope, and then we have to freeze baseline, and then we do a performance measurement. So some of the processes that we have spoken in the integration management is all about, baselining and working towards that. Whereas in Agile, it's more adaptive to changes as well. So the project scope management process, as per PMBOK, it is a process required to ensure that project includes all the work required and only the work required. So I'll tell you during the scope statement. To complete the project successfully, managing the project scope is primarily concerned with defining and controlling what is and not included in the project. So we need to be very careful when the project scope is defined. So when a project scope is defined, there could be certain factors which probably we may not include as part of the scope. So the process is like this. So we get the requirements from the customer, we talk to the stakeholders, gather the requirements, and then we freeze the scope, define the scope. So a lot of people are under assumption that the scope is created in a project charter and then the requirements are gathered based on the scope. No, actually the order is you get the requirements, gather the requirements, and then the scope is defined. So in this case, when the requirements are there, when the scope is designed, it is possible that there are few requirements which go out of the boundary of the scope. So we need to clearly classify, or we need to clearly define what is in scope and what is not in scope in detail. So that is what it's saying, controlling what is and not included in the project. So let's look at this process: planning, plan scope management, collect requirements, define scope, then create WBS. So this is the very first step for us to create the project plan. Then we validate the scope and control the scope during monitoring and controlling. These are the 6 processes in scope management. So before getting onto the process, let's look at what is a product scope and a project scope. So what is a product scope? Product scope is talking about the features, the functionalities of the product, what this product achieves. Say for example, if I take an e-commerce website, I can say buy is a functionality, sell is a functionality, I can be a seller, I can be a buyer. So these are all the functionalities that are defined within the product. So these are the features that are available. Whereas a project scope is to deliver this product, this website, right, this e-commerce website, what are the things that I'm going to do, all the processes, all the documentations that I'm going to create, that comes under the project scope. So the work performed to deliver a product, service or result with the specified features and functions. The term project scope sometimes viewed as including the product scope. So to get this product scope, whatever is defined, what is that I'm doing here? So that is the project scope. So let's look at the first process in scope management, which is plan scope management. So before that, I would like to probably just give an example of defining what is there in scope and not in scope we discussed, right? So let's say, for example, I'm a project manager and somebody approaches me to construct a super specialty hospital. So the requirement that I get is, I need, emergency department, I need an ortho department, I need a lung department, departments for multiple organs. Now that is the requirement that I get. Now I need to create a scope around it. So during the requirements gathering, I'm also told that, the customer is saying that I wanted to build a helipad on top of my building so that in future I should be able to airlift people during emergency. But at the same time, I'm told that this is not required right now. Probably I'm just thinking about it after 5 years. Okay, now we need to define the scope. So thought process is immediately what we get is, okay, now the helipad is not required, so it's not part of the scope. Fine. So I'll create a scope saying that constructing a super specialty hospital is in scope. Fine. Now what do I need to take into consideration while defining the scope? Maybe can I just architect the building in such a way that I randomly place all these departments, and 5 years later when the customer wants to build a helipad, can I demolish the entire structure and reconstruct again? I cannot. So even though a helipad is not part of my scope today, but I may need to consider the design factor into it. I may need to architect the construction in such a way that after 5 years I should be able to build a helipad on top of it. So in scope, not only the super specialty hospital, but the design architecture which will enable the construction of a super specialty hospital 5 years later. So the design of the helipad probably is in scope, whereas the construction of the helipad is out of scope. So these are one example I can think of, but this is the situation where we get into, and where it is not clearly classified whether what is in scope and not in scope. And sometimes during the end of the project, during the user acceptance testing, this is where there is kind of an argument or debate going on between the customer and the service provider. Okay, so now let's get into the plan scope management, the first process in scope management. So what is plan scope management? It is a process of creating a scope management plan that documents how the project scope will be defined, validated and controlled. So please note that this is the first subsidiary document that we are creating as part of the develop project management plan process. So here, any document, any plan that we are going to create is going to talk about how we are going to do that. For example, in scope management, we are talking about how the scope is going to be defined, how it will be validated, how it will be controlled. So the inputs, tools and techniques, outputs, as usual for every process. The key input is going to be the project management plan. So here is we need to be very clear again. We are talking about project management plan being an input. Then we are also saying scope management plan is part of a project management plan. So again, assume that you are in nth iteration. So which means at least few rounds of iterations of creating a project management plan is already done. And now that becomes an input for you to create a scope management plan. So we are not creating it, so we are just probably updating it over a period of time. Then the project charter, in case if this is the very first time you're going to create the project management plans, I mean the scope management plan, then project charter is going to be a key input there. And of course EEF and OPA. The tools and techniques, as usual, like any for planning purposes, like expert judgment, meetings and data analysis are going to be the tools and techniques. And we have a couple of outputs here. One is scope management plan, which is going to talk about how the scope will be managed and controlled, and also how it will be defined. But one more is requirements management plan. So this is going to talk about how the requirements will be gathered, how it will be documented as well. So requirements gathering is a big process, and we'll be talking about that in the collect requirements, which is the next process. For that, requirements management plan will be the key input. So the key benefits of this process is provides guidance and direction on how scope will be managed through the project. That's the key benefit here. So let's look at the inputs of plan scope management, project management plan, which we have already discussed, project charter, EEF and OPA. And let's get into the tools and techniques. Again, expert judgment. So we have all the inputs like project charter, project management plan. So project manager looks into that, gets a judgment, as well as talking to the experts. Meeting with all the key stakeholders and trying to see what needs to be done there, how to create a project scope statement, scope management plan. The data analysis, if we are in nth iteration, already the project is already running. So you get a data analysis, and if at all a new requirement or something is going to come up, how are you going to handle? So that is going to be another technique that will be used to create this project scope management plan. The outputs, scope management plan and requirements management plan. So scope management, as I said, is going to define how the scope will be defined, developed, monitored and controlled and verified. It's a major input to develop project management plan process and other scope management processes, which we are going to see in some time. The other key subsidiary document is requirements management plan, which is going to talk about how requirements will be analyzed, documented and managed. So what are the different techniques that we are going to use to collect the requirements? So those are going to be part of this plan. So the next process in scope management plan is collect requirements. So we have defined how the scope will be managed, and we have also created a document called requirement management plan talking about how the requirements will be gathered, analyzed and documented. Now we are getting into the next process of collecting the requirements. So this is a process of determining, documenting and managing stakeholder needs and requirements to meet project objectives. So the requirements are gathered talking to the different stakeholders, understanding the stakeholders' needs and then coming out with the requirements document. So let's look at the inputs, tools and techniques and outputs. Inputs, again the project management plan, project documents, assuming we are in nth iteration again, business documents, project charter, agreements, EEF and OPA. The tools and techniques, data gathering, how we are going to get these requirements, expert judgment, data analysis, decision making, data representation, interpersonal and team skills, context diagrams, prototypes. There are multiple ways of gathering the requirements. So those are some of the things that we will be looking at. And output is going to be requirements documentation, and this is very, very important, requirement traceability matrix. So we'll just talk about that shortly. So let's get into the details of how the requirements are gathered with the inputs. So inputs is project management plan, we have already discussed about it. Project documents, any document can be an input here during the course of the project. Business documents, which is your business case and benefit management plan. The project charter and the agreements, the contract agreements. That's going to help the project team to understand whether the requirements are within the boundary of that agreement or not. Then the other inputs are enterprise environmental factors and organization processes. So it's for us to go and refer to the historical data. So tools and techniques. So one is expert judgment, again talking to experts, trying to understand, given the high level definition of the project, what could be the requirements be. Data gathering. So these are all some of the techniques like brainstorming, interviews, focus groups, questionnaires and surveys, benchmarking. So brainstorming, talking about getting all the stakeholders together and brainstorming regarding the scope of the project. Then interviews, talking to the stakeholders, questioning them, and based on the answers, we try to collect the requirements. Then the focus groups, making all the stakeholders sit together, facilitate the project manager or the business analyst, facilitate and try to get the requirements so that there is no conflict of interest there. Questionnaires and surveys, sometimes we send out the questionnaires to all the stakeholders. Maybe it's not possible for us to go and talk to them individually. So providing the questionnaires based on the responses that we get, generally the product team does that. So if we are releasing a product to the market, then there's nobody to give us the requirements, right? So we send out the questionnaires and surveys, and based on that we understand the needs in the market and then come out. So these are all some of the methods. Then data analysis, one is document analysis, looking through the existing document and trying to understand, that's one way. Then decision making, either voting or multi-criteria decision analysis. If multiple people are having different kind of opinion, then we can go by voting in terms of closing out the requirements. Then data representation, so this is another way to do that. One is affinity diagram and mind mapping, trying to see how different ideas are grouped together and then how we can conclude on these requirements. Interpersonal and team skills with respect to facilitation, observation and conversation, that's another key things. Say for example, I want to automate certain things which is currently manually running today, so I don't need to go and gather the requirements. I can just observe in the production plant to see how things are happening and then understand the requirements. So that's another way of doing it. Context diagram in terms of trying to see how the system flows are. And then prototypes, so this is another key thing. So in case if the customer is not very sure about what exactly he needs, then we can start building prototypes and try to showcase so that customer gets much more clarity and faster feedback are given, so that we come out with the required definition of all the requirements here. So these are different ways of using the techniques. And then now let's look at the output, which is going to be the requirements documentation. This talks about what that requirements are all about. So it's going to contain all the list of all the requirements with the description about it. And the key document is requirement traceability matrix, which is we call as RTM. So this is it's a matrix which will help the project manager to track all the requirements, whether all the requirements have been addressed in the deliverable or not. So requirement document may run into 100 pages, and there could be, let's say, hundreds of requirements mentioned in that document. But sometimes we in practical see that when we hand over the deliverable to the customer for testing, customer finds out that there are two or three requirements being missed. So it's because that the project manager may not be able to traverse to all the 100 pages every day and try to see whether anything has been addressed or missed. So in that context, this RTM is a single spreadsheet where we can have the references to the requirements documentation and have the single line which talks about all these requirements in a snap. Looking at the snapshot, we know exactly whether the requirement has been considered, where the requirements are right now, whether it's in design, testing or UAT. And along with that, we can also associate all the configuration items, that is all the design documents, all the code files. For example, if you are in a software industry, all the test cases pertaining to the requirements, everything can be linked into one document, which will provide much better clarity for the project manager, and it will enable him to not to miss any requirements and throw any surprises at the end of the the testing phase. So it's a very important document. Any manager should handle this. So next process in project scope management knowledge area is define scope. So now that we have gathered the requirements, now that we have the requirement documentation in place, so now we start building the scope around it. We start creating a scope and mentioning what is in scope and what is out of scope. So define scope, it's a process of developing a detailed description of the project and a product. So let's look at the inputs: the project management plan, project charter, project documents, OPA and EEF. These are the inputs for this process. Techniques again, expert judgment, data analysis, product analysis, decision making and interpersonal and team skills. Outputs, project scope statement and project document updates. So a lot of things we have already seen, maybe one or two is new here. So the key benefits is describes a product, service or result boundaries by defining which requirements collected will be included and excluded from the project scope. So what is included and excluded? That's very, very important. The scope statement is the important which we need to baseline over a period of time. So whenever a new requirement comes in, then that will be measured against the project scope statement. So let's look at the inputs here. Again, project management plan, we know. The key subsidiary document is going to be a scope management plan that was created in the very first process. Then, of course, the project charter, project documents like assumption log, requirements documentation, risk register, then OPA and EEF. So tools and techniques, expert judgment, talking to experts, trying to come out to see how a project scope statement can be defined. Then the product analysis. For projects that have a product as deliverables as opposed to service result, product analysis can be an effective tool. So what is the product is? We have already seen what a product scope is. It's nothing but the features or functions that are a part of the product, right? So it includes techniques such as product breakdown, system analysis, requirements analysis, systems engineering, value engineering and value analysis. So this will help the project manager and the business analyst to define the scope. Then again, decision making and interpersonal and team skills like negotiation, communication skills. Finally, we get the output, which is your project scope statement, which talks about the project scope, the major deliverables, assumptions and constraints. Please note that wherever possible, the assumptions and constraints needs to be mentioned so that it can be relooked when we look at the risk management. Then the other outputs could be assumption logs. All these assumptions may get here, the requirements documentation, requirement traceability matrix can undergo an update anytime, and then stakeholder register, because stakeholder register is going to contain all the requirements of all the stakeholders. The next process in scope management is create WBS. So now that we have defined the scope, now this is the start of creating a project plan for the project manager to come up with a list of all the work packages, activities, then starts assigning resources. But that's not part of the scope management. To create WBS is the very first step where you break down the scope into multiple deliverables. So the process of subdividing the project deliverables and project work into small, more manageable components. So that more manageable components is what we call as work packages here. Work packages. Let's see how we do that. So before that, let's look at the inputs, the project management plan, project documents. So when we see the project management plan here, it will be the scope management plan. When we talk about project documents, it's going to be the scope statement. So those that were created during this scope management knowledge area, the previous process. EEF, OPA. Tools and techniques, the important tool and technique is decomposition and expert judgment, we all know. Outputs, scope baseline and project documents updates. So this is the output. So key benefits provide a structured vision of what has to be delivered. So we look at it. So let's look at the inputs. Scope management plan is an input as part of the project management plan. Then scope statement and requirements documentation for the project documents, EEF and OPA. Pretty simpler outputs which we have already seen. Decomposition. So this is the important technique that we need to know. A technique used for dividing and subdividing the project scope and deliverables into a small, more manageable parts. So I keep subdividing it. So we can see an example here. So if you have a project, I may have phase 1, phase 2, 3 and 4. Within phase 1, I may have deliverable 1, 2.1, So phase 2 I may have 2 deliverables, and then so I keep subdividing the scope into multiple more manageable components. So what is the lower level component? That this lower level component is what we call as work package. Please note that the work packages or WBS will only have deliverables and not activities. It does not contain any activities. So all these low level packages, work packages, are all deliverables. So if I get into your projects and try to see what is your project all about, if I just look at all the work packages, then I understand what your entire scope is all about. So for example, what do we mean by a work package and what do we mean by an activity? Let's say, for example, in a construction of a building, I say foundation as a work package. Then what is that? I can have an activities for that, probably buying raw materials, assigning the laborers to build the bricks, and creating the cement, the formula for mixing the sand, cement, and whatever. So these are all the activities that we do to lay the foundation. So laying the foundation is the work package, whereas to arrive at the work package, I need to do certain activities. So that activities is not covered as part of this create WBS process. The first stage, we only define the work packages. So to which level should we go? The work packages should be created, or the WBS should be drilled down into more manageable components. Until such level, I will not be able to break down the work package into multiple work packages. So that's one, and it should be reasonably estimated as well. So that's the level we will have to drill down. So this entire process of subdividing this work is what we call as decomposition. So the other technique is expert judgment. Again, talking to people, talking to experts, and we have the scope defined. Now we try to look at how the scope can be divided further. Output, we have the scope baseline. So because once the WBS is created, we have all the work packages, which are all the deliverables, then we baseline the scope. So what is scope baseline? It's an approved version of a scope statement. WBS and its associated WBS dictionary. So let me talk about WBS dictionary for a while. So WBS is nothing but all this work packages, right? So we subdivide into multiple more manageable components called work packages, and WBS dictionary is nothing but a detailed description of each and every work package. For example, it may talk about what this work package is all about, description of that. It may talk about who are all the people working on that, what are all the dependencies between these work packages, and so on. So this is again a living document which will get updated over a period of time. Initially, this WBS dictionary will only have the description of the work packages. So baseline is going to have a combination of all the scope statement, which is an approved scope statement, WBS and its dictionary, that can be changed only through formal change control procedures. So wherever we see this baseline, it has to go through only the change control process. So the approved version of the scope statement includes the description of the project scope, major deliverables, assumption and constraints, which we saw that as part of the project scope statement. WBS is a hierarchical decomposition of the total scope of work. Dictionary is a document that provides detailed deliverable, activity and scheduling information about each component of the WBS. So by providing a WBS dictionary to for example, if you are providing a work package to a resource will have all the details that is required regarding that work package. So he gets everything which is documented in the dictionary will help him understand what this work package is all about. And then the project document updates, other project documents that we update as part of your create WBS output. So the next process in the scope management is validate scope. So it's a process of formalizing acceptance of the completed project deliverables. So this is where the customer is going to get in and try to look at the deliverables and is going to validate against the scope, and then if everything is fine, then the customer is going to sign off on the deliverables. So this is not a one-time activity. During the course of the project, there could be multiple deliverables, and the customer may come in at any time. So finally, once all the deliverables are out, and the final validation will be done and the customer signs off. So the inputs: project management plan, project documents, verified deliverables, work performance data, and tools and techniques: inspection and decision making. And output, the key is accepted deliverables, the change request, and the work performance information, and project documents updates. So one tip I can give you is, wherever you see this work performance data as an input, you will see work performance information as an output. So the raw data after processing becomes work information after performing actions. So let's look at the key benefit, which brings objectivity to the acceptance process, increases a change of final product, service, or results accepted by validating each and every deliverable. Like I said, it's not a one-time activity. There could be multiple deliverables which are validated as and when the deliverables are completed. So inputs, again, the project management plan. So scope management plan and requirement management plan plays a key role. Project documents, lessons learned register, quality reports. We are going to validate the deliverables, so the quality reports will help defining the quality. Requirements documentation, RTM, for us to ensure that all the requirements are being tracked and monitored and closed. Verified deliverables, project deliverables that are completed and check for correctness through the quality control quality process. So here there are two processes. One, we are talking about validate scope, and we'll be talking about control quality in quality management. So the difference between both are inspection. Both are involved in testing the deliverables out. But quality control is not only testing but looking for other performance factors also. But the difference between, from a testing point of view, the difference between validate scope and control quality is the validate scope is done by the customer, whereas the control quality is done by the internal QA team. So even before we release something to the customer, we do an internal testing, right? So that is the QA, control quality process. We'll talk more when we go to quality management. And the work performance data, which is the raw data that is available for each and every activity within the project plan. So tools and techniques: inspection, which is nothing but the testing, includes activities such as measuring, examining, and validating to determine whether work and deliverables meet requirements and product acceptance criteria. So that's the reason we have this requirements document also as part of the input to validate against whether the deliverables are covering all the requirements or not. So it's basically testing. And then decision making in terms of saying whether we can accept or not. So the outputs: accepted deliverables. So now the customers validate the deliverable and say formally signs off on the deliverables if everything is meeting their expectations. If it is not, then probably a change request may come in if there are defects or any other changes may be addressed via change request. And work performance information. Now the work performance data that we got as an input now converts into an information which gives a variance analysis basically. So includes information about project progress, such as which deliverables have started, the progress deliverables are finished, or which have been accepted. And finally, we also have the project document updates. Your lessons will register, documentation, RTM may get updated once you have validated the scope. So the next process in scope management is the control scope. So this is again part of monitoring and controlling, and it is the last process in this knowledge area. So this control scope is a process monitoring the status of the project, and product scope, and managing changes to the scope baseline. So it monitors the status of the project and product scope, and also manage changes to the scope baseline. Now that we have seen the validate scope process earlier, so what if there are any issues in that? So obviously, which means we are deviating from the scope. Customer has found out some issues, then we need to control now. We need to put a corrective action in place. So let's look at the inputs: the project management plan, documents, work performance data, OPA, or the inputs. Data analysis, this is nothing but the work performance data. We provide a data analysis like trend analysis, variance analysis, and then see where there is a deviation, where there is a variance, and then take actions accordingly. Get the work performance information, because data is part of the work performance data as an input, so information is an output here. So change requests, we are in monitoring, controlling change requests if there is any deviation, project management plan updates, and project document updates. So the key benefit allows the scope baseline to be maintained throughout the project, which means that no unnecessary changes are really creeping in inside. So the inputs, project management plan. Some of the subsidiary plans could be your scope management requirements, change management plan, scope baseline, performance measurement baseline. These are all some of the documents part of the project management plan. Then we have some project documents like requirements document, RTM, and lessons learned register. Then the work performance data, the raw data of all the activities, and then OPA. Tools and techniques, data analysis. So it's nothing but the variance analysis, determining the cause and degree of difference between the baseline and actual performance. So we always compare against the baseline, and if there is any deviation, so actual performance and the baseline, if they are in sync, then we are on track. If there is any deviation, then that's where the changes get into, so that we need to bring the project back on track. So that's the key technique used in control scope. And output is going to be the work performance information, talking about what exactly is the variance is all about, and the change request. Project management plan updates, so any of these documents which was part of the input may get updated during the course. And then project documents updates, any other documents like requirements document. RTM generally gets updated because we are updating the project track of each and every requirements. And lessons learned register, because any challenges or best practices that we have put in, that will be documented here. So that concludes the control scope. And the entire, now we have covered all the processes within the scope management knowledge area. So quick review, what is a project scope management? Talking about defining the requirements and coming out with a project scope, and creating a project scope statement with what is in scope and what is out of scope, and coming out defining the scope and how to define the scope, how to monitor and control the scope is part of the scope management plan. Then key terms in project scope statement, we looked at the product scope and a project scope. Then the project scope management processes, and we also saw some of the scope baseline components like scope statement, WBS, and WBS dictionary. So this concludes the project scope management knowledge area.
Acadgild. Average is dead.